Hi, my name is Princess Sanders, and I am an LPN to RN BSN student at Indiana State University. Today, I would like to talk to you about clinical trials. Some people understand what all goes into a clinical trial, while many others do not. Here is an opportunity to gain a little bit more understanding about what a clinical trial truly means. Take this opportunity to take the pre-test before you begin. The learning objectives that we will accomplish today are: the viewer will understand the framework of a clinical trial. The viewer will understand why clinical trial jargon should be eliminated. The viewer will discover the importance of cognitive wealth relating to clinical trial terminologies. The viewer will acknowledge the need for a full disclosure of impending expenses during clinical trial participation. The viewer will make an informed decision before clinical trial enrollment. Did you know that not all clinical trial participants complete a clinical trial? Here I present to you the clinical trial abandonment rates per NIH.gov. 30% of participants abandon clinical trials and are not able to get to the finish line. There may be several reasons as to why a clinical trial participant abandons a clinical trial. Today we're going to discuss some reasons that are preventable. Let's first discuss some clinical trial jargon. The terminology clinical trial. Although some believe that clinical trial only is intended to describe the investigational drug, it does not. Clinical trials involve the standard of care procedures and or medications as well as the investigational drug. It encompasses everything that will take place during the time period that you are on a clinical trial and all procedures that relate to that clinical trial. Next, you have your standard of care. Standard of care are procedures and or medications that the patient would have received whether they were on a clinical trial or not on a clinical trial. Now let's talk about the investigational drug. By all means, this is probably one of the reasons why you are on a clinical trial, especially if it is related to rolling out a medication. An investigational drug is not FDA approved. FDA stands for Food and Drug Administration. And what that means is that that drug has not passed all the tests deemed as safe and therapeutic for a condition. And that is the reason why you're on that clinical trial. You're there to help society and the pharmaceutical company determine whether this medication is therapeutic for your condition. Now for the magic words as it relates to a clinical trial. No cost. Please keep in mind that the investigational drug will always be no cost to the patient. This is because it has not been FDA approved and cannot be charged to a patient. However, on a clinical trial, we normally have standard of care procedures and or medications that the patient would have received regardless of whether they were on the trial or not on the trial. And therefore, that is the patient and or the insurance company's responsibility. Again, the investigational drug is no cost to the patient. However, there are standard of care procedures that will take place on a trial that will be the patient's responsibility. But I thought participating in a clinical trial was free. There lies the dilemma. There are some things to keep in mind as a participant or prospective participant on a clinical trial. Most clinical trial coordinators are requested not to discuss specific financial details. You know why? Because this is to avoid offering inaccurate information, thus decreasing variances of explanations as it relates to the financial aspects of a clinical trial. Also keep in mind that most coordinators do not understand specific financial details. Their role in the clinical trial process is to make sure that the participant and the procedures are connected. They are tasked with combining the participant and the procedures. Their area of expertise is not finance. Patients have preconceived belief about the cost of participation. Remember that no cost we talked about on the jargon slide? Well, that is a preconceived notion that most patients have as it relates to clinical trials. Because it is a clinical trial does not mean participation is free. Do you know why? Because there are, yep, you guessed it, standard of care procedures that the patient will be responsible for, whether they were on a clinical trial or not. We as the healthcare provider must take ethical accountability, or it may resort to legality. So here's some ethical considerations for the patients. Those patient rights, especially as it relates to clinical trial. Let's talk about three of them. The patient right to informed consent, the patient's right to information, and the patient's right to refuse research participation. Another ethical consideration is enhanced stress. When we don't explain to patients what they are or should be expecting to encounter, this increases their stress levels. By all means, they are already ill or dealing with an ailment. Let's not increase that stress any further. Also, at this time, patient vulnerability is at its all-time high. Depending on the condition, some patients feel as though this is their last resort. We want to make sure that this phase of their sickness is the best part of it. So some accountability and legal ramifications, and by all means, this is new. We want to start enacting this to make sure that we as a healthcare provider are doing our part to make sure this experience is enjoyable. Patients will need to complete a pre-enrollment quiz, and it must be placed on file. The lack thereof is an opportunity for legal ramifications against the provider. Also, patient signatures of testament for financial responsibility should also be filed away in the patient's records as it relates to this clinical trial. So we developed the clinical trial pre-enrollment quiz. This is a quiz of 10 questions that each prospective participant will need to complete. There are 10 questions that all must be answered correctly and filed in the patient's database. We determined that a pre-enrollment quiz would be necessary for all prospective patients based on a journal article labeled Factors Influencing Participation in Clinical Trials, Emergency Medicine versus Other Specialties. This article was located in Western Journal of Emergency Medicine, Integrating Emergency Care with Population Health. Take a look on the reference page to locate that article. I hope you were able to learn a little bit more about clinical trials, what goes into clinical trials, and how to avoid a surprise during your participation. Please review these references, take the pre and post test, as well as review the pre-enrollment quiz, which happens to be the same as the test. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful day.